Welcome to a hardcore investigation of A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. So I have got like a thoroughly annotated with all kinds of different stuff version of this story. And I'm going to make some new annotations. I got some of my favorite colors right here. I got a black, I got a red, I have a really nice purple, and then I have this highlighter here too. So I'm going to read some things out loud. I'm going to talk about some of the different interpretations of the story that are available. I'm going to talk about a little bit about literary history and how William Faulkner fits into the grand scheme of things as far as American letters or the history of literature in the United States goes. And we'll get started right there. Let me give you a little tour of the stuff that we have here first. So what we have, we've got some collective unconsciousness business here. Collective unconsciousness has to do with Jungian analysis and archetypes. This is here because this story is a great one for that. In fact, here's an analysis, a Jungian analysis of A Rose for Emily. So Carl Jung was a psychologist, and he was a student of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud presented us with very, very interesting and provocative ideas about human development and human values and drives. Why do we do the things that we do? Why are we the way that we are? Those are the types of questions that he and then later Jung asked. And then they've taken this whole framework and turned it into a way to analyze literature, because literature reflects actual humans and the actual world and the things that they do. So this is a work of literary criticism from a Jungian perspective. And I'll be talking about those ideas a little bit, but first let's talk about William Faulkner, who he was and what he did. First of all, he was from Mississippi, southern state of Mississippi, and he won the Nobel Prize. And he was alive between these two dates right here, 1897. And you can, of course, like pause the video and copy in all the stuff that you see right here, or not, depending on what your personal needs are. And between 1897 and 1962, he was alive. He is like, so we have like, in literature, we have like eras. Sometimes they're called eras, and sometimes they're called other things, but he was known as a modernist. That's partially like how did he write? What was his philosophy of literature? He was a modernist. And the modernist movement started after World War I. The world really changed after World War I. So you can see already how we have the intersection of history and art, because World War I saw things like 25,000 young men killed on a single day, on a single battle. And so it was like horrific in ways that are really hard to understand. Like just imagine 25,000 dead bodies that were, shortly before that, they were laughing and they had futures, and then they did what they were asked to do. They stood in a certain place, they moved forward, they protected a certain thing, and in short order, 25,000 were dead. That was the Battle of the Somme. And so the modernist movement started after that, which was a different view on human beings and our place in the universe, that had a lot of impact on the individual, or it investigated like the individual experience, what we call subjectivity, which means what you see and what I see might be different, even if we're looking at the same thing. So this is called subjectivity. Was a big part. And we also see in the modernist movement like the absurd. He's also associated with another movement. So he was a modernist, and he's also associated with what's called the Southern Gothic literary tradition. Southern Gothic, which has got a lot of really groovy writers, some of whom we will be reading. So Southern Gothic writers, Carson McCullers is one of them. She wrote a short story called The Jockey. So McCullers is one of them. And Cormac McCarthy. They're not all Mick names, but these are two that we will be reading. McCullers and McCarthy are also Southern Gothic. And so the Southern Gothic takes elements of Gothic literature, which really started with like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and was further built by Edgar Allan Poe, where we just look at some of the darker aspects of human motivation and experience, and especially some of the darker settings like haunted houses and heavy symbolic. If you think Poe, Southern Gothic is where you take that and you look at that like through the history of the South and the place of the South. So these are really cool writers. We'll read them. So that's kind of how Faulkner fits into the grand scheme of things. Nobel Prize winning type of dude. And so when we're looking at A Rose for Emily, our key questions would be like, how does the society/individual handle transformation, economic and cultural? So there's big transformation because this story has quite a span. The story, Emily's lifespan, which I'll flip to, I did a little math and I looked carefully like at the different 30 years ago this happened, 10 years happened, this happened. So basically the story, her lifespan is about the Civil War. So because this is Southern Gothic literature, we're looking heavy duty for symbolism. So the symbolism is that her life is like 70 years after the Civil War. Or she died at about 74, I think. So I think it really matches up probably perfectly with the Civil War. If we say that the Civil War started in like 1863 or I think it was like 1863 to 561 to 65 was the Civil War. But it matches up with her life. So she dies in 1935, which was like a lifespan after the Civil War. So the question is like, how does the town remember the Civil War? So let's look at that a little bit. When we're seeing, like, let's just read some of it and see what's going on, the key questions that you have. So when Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. Our whole town went to the funeral. So my question is, like, who is the narrator? Who is that narrator? And this is like, as you're reading early on, you start to ask these questions and hopefully find answers as you read deeper. The men threw, our whole town went to the funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument. Okay, so symbols really matter. Symbols matter in Jungian analysis, collective unconscious, working for archetypes. Symbols are huge there. Symbols are also huge in Southern Gothic. And we were just served up Miss Emily Grierson as a symbol, like on a platter. Because like this right here, respectful affection for a fallen monument, that's how the men of the town felt about Miss Emily Grierson. They felt they had this respectful affection for a fallen monument. So if she's a fallen monument, and like they're telling us, like a lot of times you have to interpret and do like a lot of work to really feel out what a symbol is. For this story, we get it in the first sentence. So like, if she is a fallen monument, she's really like a statue. And so what are the characteristics of statues? That's what you want to, once you think you might have a symbol, that's what you want to say. Do you say like, what are the characteristics of a statue? Well, it doesn't move, it doesn't change. It was there, created for a purpose. It has a deeper meaning, and it has a meaning to the community that might have to do with the past. And so like that's who Emily Grierson is for this community. She's a symbol of the past. She's a continuing symbol of like what was. Big squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas. So here you think about Poe, because this is a description of the house. Decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavy, lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. So there's the passage of time. Time changes the values of properties and what's desirable and what's not desirable as far as places to live go. And so it used to be selective, now it's not selective anymore. Over here, we've got a little annotation. This has to do with, so archetypes. Archetypes have to do with persona. Your persona is like who you are to the public. Like you have one aspect of yourself that you share with the world, another that you might not even be aware of yourself, but like it's the true you. So persona, this comes from Jung, which that's the name that you have associated with archetypes. Here are the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So the idea is, and when we're looking at the South for this particular story, the idea is all these Southern people live together, work together, dream together, and it was very hierarchical. So like what so here we have like from Faulkner, when he writes of the South, writes with pity and love and nostalgia at the same time. So maybe pity for like the social inequities, the injustice, and the terrible suffering experienced by the Black Americans who lived in those communities. Love because he loved his hometown, and nostalgia is because it's gone. But before the Civil War, Southern culture was an aristocracy built on slavery. So it was automatically a very unjust system. But if you think aristocracy, think about kings, queens, dukes, honor. Think about things like chivalry. And what we really had was a patriarchal society. We had a heavy, heavy patriarchy. So patriarchy from patrius, which is the Latin for father or family, or I don't know, maybe I'm just making stuff up. Patriarchy, traditional masculine values, strong, rational, knowledgeable, invulnerable, and independent, that this is what men are. And if that is what men are, then women are not that. Women are obedient. They are voiceless. Now I'm not saying that this is how women should be. I'm saying that in this world of the South that was dominated by this patriarchy, this was the place for women. And they were mothers. They did the nurturing. And they did the caring. So according to like your Jungian literary analysis, you would look at the culture that produced the work, or you'd look at the culture that was represented in the work, and you would look for symbols and myths and truths that existed within that culture. Within that culture, it was a truth that men should be like this and that women should be like this. Myths and symbols, and in those you'll find these characters. These are the archetypes: the hero, the rebel, the lover, the orphan, the caregiver. If you think about things like Star Wars, you can see these in big heroic journeys: the innocent, the explorer, the sage. These are like types of characters. And not every book or story that you read is really the appropriate place for a Jungian analysis or for an archetypal analysis. But at different times, they're very, very useful. For instance, the hero. Who is the hero in this story? According to the truths of the collective unconscious, of the collective culture that produced the story, the South, Emily could never be a hero because she needed to be obedient, voiceless, a mother, and a nurturer. Any heroes in the story would have had to have been men. Which in this story, what men are there? Well, there were her father who died, and then there was Homer, her lover. So maybe we'll get a little bit further. Let's see what else we have here. So here we have that patriarchy in the story. So sorry I've been talking about like around the story. So where is it in the story? It's right here. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care. There we are again with like symbolic, like what was she? She was a tradition. Well, what tradition was she? The one that goes all the way back to the Civil War about what the South is supposed to be, a duty and a care. A sort of hereditary obligation upon the town dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartorius, the mayor, who fathered the edict, so this is a racist edict right here. So here we have the author is bringing our attention to the racial injustice that was present in 1894, 30 years after the Civil War. But look in the who fathered the edict. The author, Faulkner, did not have to say who fathered the edict. He could have said who brought about, or who declared, or who announced, or who supported. Instead, he chose a very specific, so this is specific diction. This is where diction comes into play, because he could have chosen any other word for that, but he chose fathered, which has a patriarchal, here we go, this is what literary analysis is, patriarchal connotation to that phrase being used in that moment, patriarchy, in the story. Moving on. Good, I got 5 minutes left to tell you what else is going on in this story. So here we have a paragraph. Here we have Miss Emily. Now, let me go back over here, because the thing that you'll get twisted up is structure in this story. Because questions of structure are like, how does the author allow time to move? How does he support the movement of time throughout the story? So here we're talking about archetypes over here. We're talking about structure over here. We're talking about diction over here. All of these different modes of understanding a story work simultaneously. So when you take one out and you examine it, that's fine. But when you put it back together again, they're all happening. Here's another one. Who is the narrator? Who is the narrator of this story? Let's see. So these are kind of the balls that are in the air. I don't know if I talked about everything. Pretty much everything over here. Pre-love. Okay, now we're moving on. Here we have diction and syntax. This, structurally, we immediately, it starts with her death, but then we go back to her life and different parts of her life. They rose when she entered, a small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony is black, cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare, perhaps that why she had her plumpness and another obesity in her, bloated like a body, long submerged in motionless water. That's like Poe for tone. I mean, could the tone be darker? Pallid hue. Her eyes were lost, 2 pieces of coal, black. So we got black, we got ebony, we got pallid, we got black. We have a corpse, even though she's alive. Diction and syntax establish tone. Tone brings out emotional effect in the reader. So what's the emotional effect from reading this? Depression, dark, sadness. You're viewing something that feels like a funeral, sounds like a funeral. Here we go again, though. She vanquished them. So when they came about the taxes, she said, I don't pay no taxes anymore. She wouldn't speak like that, but she said, I don't pay any taxes. So when they came, she vanquished them. Well, here is a word, vanquish, that once again is like diction. Like, why that word? She defeated them. She made them go away. She made them feel like they were little boys because she was more powerful. No, she vanquished them. Emily as hero. Vanquish is the word that you use when you talk about a knight defeating the guy who had captured the princess. She vanquished them. Here's a little detour. We're going to go all the way back to 1392. Because remember, Southern Gothic literature and symbols are so important. Well, symbols are names. And so no name is ever an accident in a piece of literature. And this gal's name is Emily. The father of English literature, his name is Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer. In 1392, he wrote the Canterbury Tales. And in the Canterbury Tales, the first tale is the Knight's Tale, which is all about chivalry and getting the princess. And in this tale, the voiceless character, because it was in a patriarchy, just like the South, it was in a patriarchy, the voiceless character who was the object of everyone's love was named Emily. So here do we have a reversal? She vanquished them. Is Emily the hero of this story? It was another link between the gross teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. Whose opinion is this? This is an opinion, the high and mighty Griersons. It's an opinion that's embedded in the narrator's narration. Who's narrating this story? Whose story is this? What's going on? What else do we have here? Important. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased. We were not pleased. Who is the we? Who's telling the story? But vindicated, even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all her chances. Who's the narrator? As is our custom. Homer Barron. He's not gay. He's not gay because if he were a gay character, and this story was written in 1930-something, 1920-something, if he were a gay character, he would not be written about this way. If he was a gay character, it would be a big deal to have a gay character in a story like this. So he wouldn't have been written as like this. He's always hanging out with the boys. Whenever you hear a lot of laughing, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group because he had such a big personality. He's not gay. He's just not going to get married to Miss Grierson. We all said, how did they all know she would kill herself? We said, we had said, then we said. Later we said, key moment. We sat back to watch developments. So what are the subjects and themes that we, who's the we? It's the town. The story is told from the town's perspective. The town has its own culture. The town has its own identity. We were glad because the two female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily. What does that mean for identity? What does a Grierson identity mean? Community, tradition, gossips, thwarted her woman's life. Patriarchy, matriarchy, what space is there for a woman to be an independent decision maker? Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. A lot going on in that sentence. Structure again. Back to section 1. Now that we're in section 4, it's like the story started, and then there was a whole stuff, and now we're back to section 1. He walked right through the house and out the back. So this whole thing about her servant, the black man who was her servant, what's his deal? Look, this is awesome. This is one of the best literary exits ever. He walked right through the house and out the back door and was not seen again. He walked right out of the story. There's flowers. 1935, the people at her funeral were wearing their Confederate uniforms. And they were 90 years old. Here's talking about the past. So if the subject of a story is about the past, and here's a sentence that describes what the past means, that's a pretty important sentence. The past was not diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches. Then we noticed, and that is the end of the story.